Last Sunday, the fourth Sunday in this Easter season, it is listed on my liturgical calendar not just as the fourth Sunday of Easter, but also Good Shepherd Sunday. The psalm appointed for last Sunday was the 23rd Psalm. And in addition, it happened to be Mother's Day. Thanks for the calendar. I pointed out that for most of us, I suspect that our mothers were our earliest shepherds. It was my mother who, having been raised in a very simple Methodist country church, saw to it that I would be raised similarly, beginning with, "You will learn to say your prayers." And so it was that I began learning, "Now I lay me down to sleep." Later I would also learn the one song that she knew by heart. You guessed it. "The Lord is my shepherd." As I grew older, it was my father who took me to Sunday school while he went to morning prayer at the Episcopal Church. My mother stayed home. It was her only day off. She cleaned house and cooked Sunday dinner, but said her prayers at night. It was that sort of very condensed, simple environment in which I was initially raised. I learned a very simple view of life like that. You worship God. Heaven is above. Hell is beneath. You seek and strive to be a good person, and you will do well. God will love you. And if you don't, you will have a first-hand experience of that which is down below. I mean, it doesn't get much more simple than that. In our apartment complex where we lived, there were two Jewish families and one Roman Catholic. Now, I was never sure what God they worshipped. I just knew they were different. They were different. Nice people, but different. Death became a reality to me when I was very young. I was 3 years old when my maternal grandfather died. I remember their coming to take the body, and a few days later brought the body back, put it in an open casket in the parlor, and everybody came to pay their respects. On the morning of the funeral, I was made to go into the parlor beside the coffin and say goodbye. That has left a mark on my psyche to this day. Each of us has his or her own story to tell from childhood. Some of our stories emerged in our Lenten series this year, in which we looked at end-of-life issues and how we deal with what is before us as we come to that end of our life. What is it that we have relied on? What is it that we have come to believe? What has been true and what has been false? What comforts us? What strengthens us? And what makes us fearful? What can be most frightening is when we are confronted with the fact that what we have come to believe isn't necessarily true. Think in your own life. What is it that you were taught as a child that isn't necessarily true in your life and experience as an adult. When we face that, then we become fearful. Because the foundation on which we thought was solid and unmoving, we find may be made of clay. Or worse yet, sand. So it is that we have to find a new and different way of living. That's what happened to Peter. Peter, you all know, was a good Jew, a hard-working fisherman, supported his family. Even his mother-in-law came to live with them, and he supported her. He observed all of the law of Moses, all of the high holy days, fasted when ordered to do so, made his offerings, said his prayers. Anybody who knew him would identify Peter as a good Jew, a devout Jew. But evidently there was something missing for Peter, because when Jesus came calling and invited him to follow him, he left his family and his business and took to the road with that small group of followers. And there's no doubt that Peter was the one who beat the loudest drum for Jesus on that march from north of the country to Jerusalem. Pledged his undying allegiance, was at that Last Supper that we read this morning in our Gospel. And yet it was Peter who, when the chips were down, denied even knowing. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Who in your life, who in my life, have you and I denied in some fashion? I suspect that we all know something about the guilt of that. Jesus met Peter again after that first Easter. Met him on the shores of the lake where Peter had gone back to fishing. Cooked breakfast for him. Invited him to walk with him on the beach. Peter, who denied him 3 times, Jesus forgave 3 times on that walk. A wonderful lesson. There's nothing, even the denial of God, that cannot be forgiven. It's not long after that vision that messengers arrived, sought Peter out. He was staying with Simon the tanner in the city of Joppa, as you heard in the lesson this morning. A delegation arrived from the house of Cornelius. Cornelius was not only a Gentile, he was a Roman soldier, a sworn enemy. But something was different about Cornelius. He came to be a believer. A believer. Not necessarily, obviously not a Jew. Not necessarily a label you could put on him, other than he believed in something much greater and much more devout than himself. He had heard of Peter. He sent a delegation and said, "Please come to my house. Something has happened. There's a new spirit in my house. A new believing. Please come to my house." And so Peter packs up and with some friends goes to Cornelius' house. Peter had that vision on the roof of the house where he was staying. He was hungry, lunchtime. He has a vision of a great sheep coming down, just filled with all sorts of goodies. Johnny's barbecue, you know. Peter says he can't eat because it's against his religion, and the voice from heaven says there's nothing made by God that is unclean. Nothing that is made by God is unclean. Peter goes with the delegation to Cornelius' house. He eats with them. He prays with them. He blesses them. And you would think, that's a great story. Certainly great for Cornelius. The problem is the religious folks got involved. Back in Jerusalem, it's the devout ones. They call Peter to come see them. Understand you've been consorting with the heathens. How do you explain yourself? Peter tells them about the vision he had on that rooftop, that nothing that God has made is unclean. That in God's eyes there is holiness in almost anything and in everyone. That Cornelius is as much a devout believer as any of them. You see, what has happened is for Peter, the world that he knew, that he grew up with, the things that he'd been told that were sacred, were all too small. They were all too simplified. They were all too black or white. And Peter's world had to expand. The same thing happens to us. All those things we learned as children, the simplicity of the world, the goodness or badness of this person or that person, what is true and what is false. As adults, we have found out that isn't necessarily the way things are. That there is something called grace. Grace is truly amazing. It opens the whole world to us. We can even live with those things that we got wrong. For Peter, there was no longer that division between Jew and Gentile. They were all God's people. That same process, I believe, is at work in all of us. In her book, Amazing Grace, the author Kathleen Norris tells about her friend who is a Benedictine nun whose mother is dying. She's on her deathbed. And the nun is sitting beside her. The nun says to her mama, "Think, Mama, you're about to see God. You're about to enter heaven and everybody you love will be there." Mama opens her eyes, turns her head, looks at her, raises up in bed and says, No, it's not that everybody will be there. It's that I will love everybody who's there. Norris's comment on that story is this: our hope our final hope, transforms us and makes a great difference in the here and now. Amen.